I'm going to preach on Paul's letter, 2 Corinthians, although it would have been pretty apropos to preach from the gospel about a prophet being rejected in his hometown. I was a little too afraid of that, though. So I'll let Jesus speak for himself on that and not give you any ideas. So I went with the Apostle Paul, particularly zeroing in on one line. God's power is made perfect in weakness. That's what God told the Apostle Paul in our reading today. What does that possibly mean? God's power is made perfect in weakness. It almost sounds like a riddle, doesn't it? If you're confused by that, know that you're not alone. In fact, a scholar of the New Testament named Matthew Skinner, a professor at Lutheran Seminary, notes that this part in Corinthians is known as the fool's speech because it's so puzzling. How is power weakness? How is weakness powerful? Let's work through it, because this is actually one of my favorite proclamations about who God is. So as usual, let's note the context. When Paul quotes God on this, Paul's recounting a very painful time in his life. To quote Paul, "A thorn was given me in the flesh. 3 times I appealed to the Lord." To which God responded, "My power is made perfect in weakness, and my grace is sufficient." In other words, God is saying that God does not abandon Paul when Paul goes through such moments. And that's why I love this proclamation. God is declaring right here that God is not only found in high and mighty places, but also in the trenches of our lives. God is effectively telling Paul, listen, my power is not found in avoiding or escaping or even running away from brokenness, but my power is found in my pursuit of people experiencing it. This means God is willing to use God's power in order to be present and vulnerable with us, especially in our weakest places. And that, according to God, is a perfect use of power. And that still might sound strange. And that's because that type of logic isn't natural to most of us. Because this is not the world's typical understanding of what is powerful and power. Even for most ancient religions, this is not a typical understanding of power. For instance, in the ancient Greco-Roman world, in which Paul would have been writing to the people of Corinth, those gods of that region of the world, those gods in those religions would never be associated with weakness. The gods of Plato and Aristotle, those Greek philosophers, those gods would never dirty themselves in dealing with human pain and shame and vulnerability. Those gods were always above it. That's what made them gods. They were never found in weakness. And not just Greco-Roman gods, ancient Norse gods, for your Norwegians out there, Persian gods, you name an ancient religion, and these gods were brutes, and they were warlords, and they were above human pain. They had no association with weakness, as it was deemed pathetic and impossible. And yet here God is saying, my power is made perfect in weakness. And that's not only antithetical to most ancient religions, but also to what you and I normally idolize within our own culture. What do we idolize culturally? We idolize wealth and fame and status and domination. We love the ivory towers of academia, the bank accounts of Wall Street, the toughness of politicians, the fame of celebrities, and the victory of athletes. That's who gets the most glory in our culture. And on this Independence Day, we'll celebrate and we'll emphasize the military victories and the global dominance of the United States. You will not see outside here emphases on the 4th of July on America's associations with weakness or vulnerability. That's countercultural. So with this, the general slant of our culture, it can be difficult to understand what God is saying here. That divine power is something not solely obsessed with high places, victory, or prosperity, but rather weakness. And that's why this is the fool's speech. That's the foolish thing about Christianity. It doesn't glorify dominance. And that's because Christ's love is not power over, but power with the broken and the suffering, with you and I. And if we think about that, maybe that isn't so difficult to understand as powerful. For instance, what might you think of the person that skips the who's who party in order to enter into the weakness of their friend and go be with them, the one who suffers a debilitating social anxiety instead? What might you think of a child who, rather than joining the bully and appearing to be tough, decides instead to enter the weakness of the bullied and distract the bully by making a fool of himself? What might you think of the athlete who, rather than taunting her opponent, helps her up? What might you think of countries who, rather than going to war, bypass strategies of aggression and pursue peace instead? What might you think of a God who turns weapons of war into instruments of farming and agriculture, like God did in Isaiah chapter 2? What might you think of a God who, instead of seeking revenge, seeks forgiveness, even for the wicked, like God did in Ezekiel chapter 33? What might you think of the God who, instead of embracing competition, hopes that we all make it, like Jesus implied in the parable of the laborers in the vineyard? What might you think of the God who, rather than expecting us to wash his feet in some power move, washes ours, like God did in John chapter 13? What might you think of the God who, rather than ostracizing the outcast and shaming the sinful, goes and has wine and dinner with them, like God did in Luke chapter 7? What might you think of the God who, rather than crucifying the world, was crucified for the world? Because that's the God we have. A God whose power is not just found on the side of the winning army, so to speak, but a God who's drenched in the blood and the tears of the suffering, consoling the tormented veteran, the overlooked elderly and the defenseless orphan, crying with the despairing, standing with the debt-ridden, exploited with the laborer, outcast with the outcast, caged with the migrant, ailing with the sick, sharing the wounds of the oppressed, and trembling with the homeless. That's the God we have. And to the world, that is weakness. But God's power is made perfect in weakness, because it finally is the power of love. A love that dwells with us in our places of pain and failure and shares that space with us. This is power by divine definition. So, sisters and brothers, as you come in here today, and as you go back out into that challenging world, into whatever trenches you find yourself, know that Christ dwells with you in perfect power. And therefore, according to the Apostle Paul, whenever you are weak, you are strong. Amen.